Hello, I'm professional attorney and very much amateur musician Scott Lesowitz, and in this video I'm here to discuss Gene Simmons' sensational comments claiming that former Kiss drummer Peter Criss did not actually write the song Beth, or did not even co-write it, and that was Kiss's biggest hit, at least in terms of Billboard chart position. So there are three songwriters listed for Beth: Peter Criss, Stan Penridge, and Bob Ezrin. Bob Ezrin's contributions are uncontroversial. He was the Kiss's producer, and he helped rework the song. And Peter Criss claims that he and Stan Penridge had originally written the song together when they played together in a band called Chelsea. But Gene Simmons claims in that recent interview with the Professor of Rock that Peter Criss had nothing to do with the writing of Beth, and that Stan Penridge had written the song by himself.
So Peter did not write Beth. Peter did not write Baby Driver. Stan Penridge wrote that. Peter had nothing to do with that song.
Now, as someone who has been playing the drums since I was a kid and only learned to play the guitar later as part of my mission to play as many instruments poorly as I can, I went into this ready to strongly support Peter Criss and to claim that Gene Simmons is an old kook. But now that I've looked into it more, that's not how this is going to come off. So in looking into this more and researching for this video, it turns out that both Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley have claimed in the past that they don't believe Criss co-wrote Beth. And Criss has shot back that they are wrong and that they're jealous of him. But Penridge died in 2001, and I see things on the internet that he claimed in a 2000 interview that Criss was not responsible for the song at all. But that said, I couldn't find any audio or a transcript of that interview. And Gene Simmons didn't reference any claims by Penridge in his Professor of Rock interview. So the way I interpreted Gene Simmons' comments to the Professor of Rock was that his claim is that Criss did not play a real musical instrument and did not know what the chords were in the song, but can merely hum the melody. So therefore he couldn't have co-written the song. I imagine what Simmons really wanted to say was, what do you call someone who hangs out a lot with musicians? A drummer.
Peter does not write songs. He doesn't play a musical instrument. Drums are not a musical instrument by definition. They're called a percussive instrument. Really important.
Anyway, Gene's other claim is that drum parts cannot be copyrighted.
But you cannot play a drum fill that can be copywritten. But nothing you do on drums will prevent anybody else from directly copying whatever you did and applying it to another song.
I'll talk about each of these two claims, and then I'll end with a bit of a discussion about whether Stan Penridge's heirs could reclaim Peter Criss's copyright interest in Beth. So I'll start with the claim that drum parts cannot be copyrighted. As an absolute statement like that, Gene is wrong. I know of at least two published district court cases where the court found that drum rhythms were potentially protected by copyright. But that all said, to be fair to Gene, while the amount of creative contribution that's required for copyright protection and to be considered a joint author is fairly low, drummers usually do not receive songwriting credit, and when they do, it's usually because they did something more than come up with the drum part. And probably in the real world, a drummer suing for copyright credit for his drum part against his other bandmates, probably if the drummer is going to have any chance in court, it's going to have been a really creative, unique drum part. That said, this all appears to be a purely academic discussion in the case of Beth, because it sounds to me like, from listening to the song, there are no drums in the song. And that leads us into Simmons' other contention that Peter Criss couldn't have co-written the song because, he's just a lowly drummer. And Gene's probably thinking something along the lines of, hey, what do you call a drummer whose girlfriend breaks up with him? Homeless. I know, that's awful, just awful that he might be thinking that. So anyway, I have less to say here as a lawyer and more just conjecture as a very amateur drummer and guitarist and a music fan. And on the one hand, of course, there are drummers who routinely co-write songs with so-called real musicians. And I'm also recalling my personal experience playing in bands before I started to learn to play guitar. And I made meaningful contributions to writing what I imagine now, in hindsight, were pretty awful songs. But that said, it does seem a bit off to me that a drummer would be the head writer of a song with no drums in it. There's nothing scientific behind that feeling. I could be wrong, but it just seems off to me. So getting back to this from a bit of a legal historical perspective, there certainly is a history of musicians and singers demanding songwriting credit and a cut in on the royalties for songs they performed, even though they had nothing to do with writing the songs. Elvis, for instance, was notorious for demanding a significant cut in, but this practice goes back well before Elvis, even before their record was invented. Songwriters and publishers needed prominent performers to play their songs in order to spur sheet music sales. Basically, people were not going to buy sheet music for songs they've never heard before. But one interesting angle is that while it would be very difficult in reality to happen, I need to really emphasize that, because of the difficulty in proving that Criss did not write part of the song so many years later, plus there were so many years when Penridge allowed Criss to be on the copyright registration as an author uncontested. Plus, Penridge, passed away nearly 25 years ago. And in addition, that there's also potential statute of limitations and other legal problems. But there is a theoretical possibility that if Peter Criss had nothing to do with the writing of Beth, then Stan Penridge's heirs could at least theoretically claim they have a right of termination of the transfer of copyrights. Now, because this was before 1978, this would not happen 35 years after the transfer, but it would be 56 years, which would mean 2032. So while I don't see this happening in reality, it does interest me generally about the potential of songwriters who might attempt to exercise termination rights against singers who demanded writing credit and a portion of the copyright, even though they had nothing to do with the writing of the song. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you've subscribed. Thank you.